There it is.
There we go. Just lag.
Yeah.
Anyway, could you put the experienced fighter up against an inexperienced fighter? Because that's a fun one to talk about.
Yeah, I posted it.
Okay.
So you want to go for that?
Yeah, as people start to trickle in. The experienced fighter versus the inexperienced fighter, the answer is actually a lot, but it's actually a lot that most people don't think about because it's very technical. Uh, One of the things that would clue the experienced fighter into that the other person has no experience is pretty much everything. Uh, the whole of their body, the way that where their hand positions are, where their elbow positions are. A lot of inexperienced fighters often put their hands in really weird places, like they're either too far out from their body, they're out around their face, but they're not in close enough to actually defend. Their elbows are what we call chicken wings. They sort of jut out in all sort of weird positions. You'll see it from a lot of actors that haven't been doing martial arts for very long. Their elbows stick out just about everywhere when they fight. Their stances are often either too
Hold
wide
on a
or.
second. You're echoing.
Oh, sorry. Um, is that better?
I'm still getting audio playback. Oh, I know why. Hold on a sec. No, that's not it, actually.
Am I still echoing?
Yeah, I think it's. Yeah. No, wait. Okay, guys, this is really weird. Hold on a minute while we try to sort this out.
As always, technical details.
Yeah. I think what's happening is one of the microphones is picking up audio from.
Um, if I turn it down a little,
Yeah, it's the audio coming in that's actually.
is that better?
It's going to take a minute for this to filter through. If anybody ever wondered, this is what happens where you've got audio overlap. Um, what's happening is our microphones are picking up each other, and this will take a minute to filter through.
Yay.
And then I end up in the awkward situation of actually having to listen to myself.
Yes, you do.
Okay. I think the system actually finally cleaned.
Okay. Are we good?
Believe so.
Okay. If you hear me echoing in chat, just say it in the questions and we'll try to fix it. The big thing is often actually foot position. Uh, Most people who've never fought before or have limited experience fighting don't know where to put their feet. They have no base. Um, so their stances are too shallow. They stand too high. They stand the wrong way. Their shoulders aren't turned right to actually accommodate the turn of the lower body in time with the upper body. And they often tend to punch entirely with their upper body as opposed to coordinating it with the hips and the full rotation of the shoulders, the hips, and the arm all working together to generate the force and momentum that you actually goes into a punch. So that's basically the big way that you tell an experienced fighter from an inexperienced fighter is actually the detail work with a lot of things that don't sync together, including sometimes where they look, where their eyes go, and what they're looking at, which is often the hands rather than the chest or the eyes. Because that's what's there, because their body, their mind hasn't actually been trained, and their eyes haven't been trained to filter that movement as it comes towards you. So they're often looking at the hands to see where they're going to go because they're not used to that, if that made any sense. I have. I'm working on like no sleep.
Yeah, that's actually one of the fun things we've got going on right now. If anybody's having any trouble hearing us, let me know in the comments. I think what happened was that I cranked up the audio a little bit, gain on the microphones a little bit too far. So we'll need that information.
Yes, please let us know if we're assaulting your ears.
Or, failing to.
Yeah, if you can or can't hear us. Anyway, Christian Hall has a question. How realistic are those fight scenes, like the newer James Bond movies, where they dress intensely in suits and dress shoes? I wear suits way too often, and I dislike them because they seem to limit my movement, and the shoes are awkward. Having not been a man and never worn the shoes, I cannot tell you. I'll leave that to Stark.
Yeah, no, it's not realistic. um, yeah, the design for suit is to make you look good. It doesn't give you a lot of freedom of movement. That's by design. Hold on a sec.
What do I have?
Okay, sorry about that. Starting this off with wonderful technical difficulties. Any rate, the suits aren't designed to give you a lot of freedom of movement, and as a result, you really can't get around in those or fight in a suit effectively. And if you try, it will tend to tear at the seams. Um, you can get suits tailored. It's a little bit iffy to call them suits, but you can get sport coats and the like tailored that are going to give you a lot more freedom of movement. But to actually get that really sharp tailored look and run with that, it's not something you can do in a normal suit the way you see with Bond. And the shoes are not; those are not going to be comfortable at all either. You're not going to have a lot of movement. You're not going to have a lot of traction. The style is there to present an image, not because they expect you to engage in heavy physical activity in it.
And traction is actually really important. A lot of things that people underestimate with fighting and combat is the importance of actually being able to maintain friction and maintain your grip on the ground with your feet, because that's what creates your base, which is the building blocks of all techniques that follow. So if you're actually wearing shoes that are slippery or don't grip the ground well, that's actually going to affect your fighting. Which is part of the reason why, among a lot of other reasons, why heels are a bad idea. If it wasn't obvious, but it's also that they don't grip well. Um, they're not really designed for that. To get you a lot of shoes aren't really designed to get a lot of nice traction going on the surface of the floor at when you're moving around a lot, in the same way that you would with a gym shoe or a cross trainer. That's designed to actually support that movement, especially with the ankles too. Um, a lack of ankle support can be troublesome because if your ankle rolls during a fight, you're so done. Yeah.
So yeah, no, and the short answer there, those aren't particularly realistic. Generally speaking, James Bond fights, the film fights anyway, I can't remember with the books, but the films are not aiming for realism. It's aiming for a kind of formalist design. So to an extent, I wouldn't worry about it. And you can get stuff like the sport coat I actually own and wear most of the time. It doesn't look like a normal suit coat. It's looser. It does allow freedom of movement, but then again, it's basically just a leather jacket with a different cut. So those exist. You're not going to, like you basically probably know at this point, you're not going to fight in a dress suit. Either one, actually.
And it's always worth remembering with the spy genre, especially, that there are very varying different levels uh, or types within the genre. There's the super realistic spies, where you worry about stuff like that, and that's like the George LeCarre stuff. And then you have the James Bond stuff, which is not realistic at all, but it's its own genre and it's fun in its own way, and you accept the conventions that come with it.
It's actually worth pointing out with Ian Fleming. This is like Ian Fleming and George and Leclerc were both spies and were both actually intelligence officers in British intelligence during World War II. The difference is that Ian Fleming was signals intelligence and worked primarily with military operations. So when you're looking at the kind of things he was actually engaged with, he was involved with planning, and he was involved with planning for basically special forces operations, covert ops. And this shows in the way he writes Bond. He writes Bond the way you would expect a military operator to handle a situation. Whereas Leclerc is really looking at human intelligence. He's looking at the way you actually put a spy someplace. And it's to an extent, Fleming is not really showing you or trying to tell you what a spy is. He's showing you what your Navy SEALs are, or what your well, it would have been at the time would have been OSS operatives, so your Army Rangers and the like, what they were like, as opposed to actual spies. It's something that really informs the character, at least originally, and it still survives into the modern incarnations. So when you're asking, well, this is what you could expect from somebody who is actually a military jarhead for how they would try to solve this situation, not what you expect from a spy.
Which is pretty cool, though.
It is.
When you stop and think about it, if you can get over everything else that comes with it in the books.
Yeah.
I can't.
I like Warren Ellis's comment about Bond that he's not. It's not that he's a misogynist; it's that he's a misanthrope. He hates everybody. I think that's actually pretty fair to the character.
Hmm.
Any rate, moving on from this, we've got Roberto asking about a question that we honestly, Tumblr did not eat this for you. Our own editorial process ate this. So let's actually go over this.
I actually asked my HEMA friend for an answer to this question because I didn't have it. Um, and I think I lost it in Skype. What her answer was. But basically, uh, you ultimately, what a knight wears to combat is going to be heavily dependent on what kind of combat he, or I guess if you're in a fantasy setting, she, and would be engaging in. Most knights, honestly, full plate was expensive, but what my friend said you might be thinking of is the ornamental sets rather than, which are the ones that the vast majority of the ones that survived, as opposed to the much more simpler armor types. Part of the thing of being a knight is that they do have money, or they have the backing of somebody who has money, who can afford to cover the cost of their gear. That's sort of part of being a knight. How much gear they can cover is debatable in terms of weaponry, but they're mostly going to have the full sets. You're going to need the cuirass, though. You're going to need the vambrances, which is the arms. And it's good to remember that the sabatons, which is the metal on the feet, the metal boots, are only for mounted combat. Because as fun as they are to look at, they're not actually useful because they don't bend with the ankle. Most knights would actually wear boots with steel coverings on the foot and the around the uh, yeah, no sleep shin, to protect the shin. But they would wear leather so that the ankle could actually move. Um, Our comment also was that medieval knights were weren't actually that much better than thugs. Well trained thugs, but thugs.
What you're probably thinking about with accessibility, like not having access to full sets of kit, in that case, you're actually probably thinking of mercenaries or possibly some other kind of militant order, possibly religious militant order, that wouldn't be directly associated. One of the problems, or one of the things specifically about a knight, was that they were, to an extent, a representation of their lord, whoever they were serving. So if you're in a situation where there's guys on every side of you who want to take your stuff, want to kill you, want to take your stuff, and you have these people here to demonstrate that no, you are strong enough that they cannot take your stuff, it's very important that you be able to outfit them so it looks like you can at least protect yourself, even if the rest of your lands can be completely overrun. And at that point, it becomes very important, just from a presentation standpoint, to be able to put your knights forward and say, "Look, don't mess with me. These guys will have the capacity to mess you up." Um, where you would see the problems with not having full gear. You'd see this with mercenaries. You'd also, I think I said this earlier, you'd see this with mercenaries. It was very common you'd see mercenaries out there with either they'd have a little bit of chain, or they would have, they might have a plate, they might have a breastplate, they wouldn't have full armor. And in some cases, they wouldn't even really have armor, they just have their weapon, depending on what they had access to. And we're talking about an era when there were mercenaries. There were mercenary companies that you would hire and help defend your lands. This was one of the ways you could spend your money. And the other place you would actually run into a situation where people wouldn't be armed and armored at all would be your shock troops, your basic peasants that you've pressed into service to defend your lands, and you really don't care what happens to them, so you give them a weapon, or in some cases you even don't. One of the questions we get repeatedly is about the scythe, and why is this even a thing in combat? Well, sometimes you would just press peasants into service and make them fight with whatever they had at hand, and sometimes that was just a scythe, which they would then have to retrofit so that they could actually fight with it.
And it's also worth noting that knights themselves are a special class of warrior, which they're really sort of their own group. They don't really have the same sort of, it doesn't come with the same set of rules that you would have for normal military. Um, they are your cavalry, I can't even speak today. Your cavalry, but what you're talking about when you're asking about normal soldiers, as in the non-elite, the non-nobility, and then you have your knights who are your elite, who are your nobility, and it's best not to get those two confused. The regular peasants were often, and even regular soldiers, were often sent into battle with. Yeah, I don't remember the terms because I'm too tired. If they were lucky, they got chainmail, but mostly it was just padding.
Oh, you're talking about flax padding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was whatever they felt cheap enough to outfit them with. It wasn't much. If they were really lucky, they got leather, and usually a pike or a spear. Um,
If they weren't lucky, they got their pitchforks, maybe
yes,
the torches.
yes. So it really depends on you and on your setting for how closely do you actually want to adhere to medieval warfare versus more modern ideas of combat, because they're two separate things. Um, so if you want a much more organized military, a la the 19th century, or even the the current military standards we have today, uh, that would be very different from what you would find in uh, the Middle Ages in terms of organization.
As I recall, there was also, I might be wrong about this. This might be a different question. As I recall, there was also, oh no, it is. It's part of this. The commander knight directly under the royalty. In this case, everybody that's actually attached directly to the royal guard is going to be outfitted. Um,
Oh
if
yeah.
you're if you're talking about the ones that are right there, that are in the throne room when visitors come, that's a very important part of the presentation, to say, no, don't mess with this guy. He actually has the force and the backing to keep him in position. So we probably should not screw with them. Again, if you're wandering significantly away from actual European history, and towards something else, like if you're patterning off the Vikings, then that's less true. It's assumed in some cases that the king or the lord, whatever his title is, will be in a position to retaliate directly against someone who offends him in his chambers. But that's not strictly speaking a normal European expectation that fits within the medieval and early modern period. So it's something to think about if you're really wanting to mix things up, but it's not part of the history.
Yeah. Also, most of the knights that he would be, your commander knight would be interacting with, would be members of the peerage, if they're that close to the throne, and the peerage being the lords. So they would be sons of the biggest house, the largest houses in the land, often second sons or third sons, even first sons in some cases, proving themselves. So there would be no shortage of money throwing around. They'd be throwing around. So, and in often cases, a knight's gear is directly dependent on either who his lord is or how much money his family has, or depending on your fantasy setting, her. It would be, but either in either case, it's dependent on their patron or their uh, or what they make themselves. And a lot of knights made their way in the world through tournament, um, as much as they did through battle, and earned. That's how a lot of younger knights or knights from low families made their way into grander company, working with princes or lords, and often you can count on each lord to have his own entourage. So he would have his own contingent of knights that would serve under him, which was why that you made deals and arrangements and agreements between the different lords. And they were all sort of warlords in their own way. So it's a really question of how much do you want to adhere to medieval history and the politics that were at play there, or your own version of your fantasy version where your knights might just be fairly elite cavalry in heavy armor. So
Hope that helps. I'm sorry that this one did not make it to the blog. That's just a screw up on our part because we were working on it. It went to editorial hell and was never heard from again. So I am glad that we were able to get that one to you. I'm going to.
I hope it helped.
I'm going to pick from the list. We've got. Take this. So I'm going to try this, and I'll apologize if I screw it up. We've got Frederick Bjorkman. Uh, I'm writing a sci-fi adventure where some of the characters are a special branch of a colonial military. They're meant to be dropped straight into combat and move fast. What equipment would be optimal for such a combat role? Okay. So you're going to need versatile weapon options. Usually, when you're talking about even just a modern setting, the assault rifle or even something like the battle rifle is actually very useful in this regard because it has a good range of options for close and long range use. Actually, I should say medium to long range use. When you say dropped straight into and combine that with colonial military, I get the impression you're talking about orbital drops, and that could be a mistake for me. I honestly don't know what you're doing with your setting. But yeah, you're going to need a fairly versatile. Sorry, this is going to sound kind of stupid, but a fairly versatile range of options on the weapons. And again, most automatic rifles will give that. You might also see some members carrying shotguns. There are actually hybrid assault rifle shotgun combinations. Forget what the military designation is, but it's an underbarrel shotgun that attaches to the M16. There's no reason that can't be used for very close work. There's no reason they can't simply carry a shotgun. Some of them carry shotguns as a secondary weapon. That's an option. Another option is flamethrowers.
Before Stark overwhelms you, let's talk for a moment about what we mean about versatility. Your average soldier is going to need, when he's talking about versatility, options for close range, which are hand to hand, and a pistol, start getting into pistol range. So they would probably be carrying a knife to supplement their hand to hand if they needed it. Uh, the what he was talking about with the assault rifle is your mid to long range weapon, which allows you to do more, and a weapon that can do both jobs will carry you further than a weapon that can just do one. So the further you can shoot means you can clear the area. But if you get into a situation where you can't fight long range and you're stuck at mid range, then the weapon still won't fail you. And since you don't know what kind of situation you're going to be dropping into, that versatility really helps to know, to have your options of what you can switch to depending on the situations you find yourself in. It's a question of being prepared for the unknown, essentially. Um, which is why soldiers carry multiple weapons, just as a rule.
Yeah. Um, Sorry. One of the other options for closer range, not technically this is would qualify as medium range, is flamethrowers. You'll see these a lot in fantasy. Historically, they don't see a lot of use because, well, that's not true. Historically, they did see a lot of use. They're a very horrific weapon. The entire point is you set somebody on fire and then kill them with it. And they're also very dangerous to the user. I forget the specific statistics, so these numbers might be slightly off. But a U.S. flamethrower in World War II had, I think it was 7 seconds, maybe 12 seconds of ammunition, and it had an effective range that meant there was a real risk that if the user would get shot, they would go up in flames. So there's a reason why you don't see these today, but in a sci-fi setting, it's possible you could go to this. Um, Ironically, the Marines in Aliens are probably worth looking at. The pulse rifle, where they have an automatic weapon, they have a ridiculously high firing automatic weapon. Everybody's outfitted with an underbarrel grenade launcher, flamer units. You've got heavy support. You have heavy support Marines that are using the smart guns with the auto targeting setups. Um, in spite of the film being from 1984, I believe, or 86, and in spite of the film actually being a Vietnam War film in disguise, it's a pretty good look at some of the stuff you could see in a future soldier environment, uh, especially if you're wanting to stick within the range of we give them conventional ballistic weapons as opposed to energy weapons. Um, the one thing you don't see there very much is probably some kind of augmented vision uh, heads-up display devices. These are I've seen these people criticize these as somewhat cliche at this point, but it is something that we're going to end up with. Cameras mounted on the weapons that allow the user to have a specific target of where they're looking. The stuff that's not there yet today is things like target acquisition software that will actually allow them to identify and track moving objects at distance. Ironically, the motion tracker in Aliens isn't a bad idea from a military concept, but you'd probably see something like that that's far more useful and integrated, possibly integrated directly into their armor, so that they
I
can see
always
this.
like the Crisis heads up display.
Yeah, the nanosuits in Crisis are great. That's another thing to look at. I also really love the weapon design there. It's probably if you've never played those games and you're not averse to first person shooters, those are probably worth looking at.
They're
Also, they should
fun.
be pretty cheap
Well, at
around.
least the first two are fun.
Yeah, the third one
Um,
is kind of hilariously
yeah.
badly written.
But the heads up display in Crisis, I one of the reasons I like that as opposed to some of the other sci-fi heads up displays I've played with is that it feeds really nicely into a sense of limitation, and that you can target multiple enemies, but I always miss some. Um, but I like the way that it filters from infrared. It'll let you track behind buildings. It gives you targets, but it gives you options on what you want to do. So if you were working with multiple characters, they could each approach the heads up display in different ways to make it for their preferences to make it more unique as you're establishing the different ways they like to fight. just as separate from the unit, because everybody, even if they get the same training, everyone fights a little differently. They have their own version that they enjoy, and it's always worth playing around a little bit with powers that are similar to sort of get a feel for that, at least for me. Um,
Also, one of the interesting points that I know for a fact you haven't seen this because you've only played the second one. One of the interesting things the first game actually does with the nanosuits, and then because of the way the second and third game are structured, it's just gone, is you can, between the suits, you can actually sync up HUD data. So target tracking from one Marine or from one of the Delta operators in a nanosuit can actually sync data to other members of their squad, which that's actually something that'd be very useful in the field, very useful in combat, and something that would not surprise me at all as a feature in some kind of future war setup with this kind of tracking software.
you don't have to keep the body horror aspect of the Crisis nanosuits.
No, you
I
don't.
like
That's
them,
cool
but
though.
it's cool. uh, in the trade off between that and the Master Chief sort of power armor, where you can just walk through anything, or the guy is pretty much destroying his body as he goes. There's a fun play between those two very different variants of fighting, uh, depending on what you want actually for your sci-fi characters to actually be wearing as a one with either their drop suits or their regular combat gear. Do they wear something that's synthetic and molds to their skin and gives them armor? Are they wearing powered armor? It's everything you kind of pick for them on that sort of level will dictate more of what they're able to do and how they fight and how they approach combat. And really, with a question of where the question's at is the way that they solve problems. So if they wanted to move quick, but if they want to move quick, you can always have powered armor that will allow you to do that, or you just mow down through your enemies, and they can actually take a lot of damage without having to, you know, keep themselves in cover or contained. Versus something like the Crisis Nanosuit, where you really do have to sort of moderate yourself some, and that's much more suited to, say, a quick and quiet sort of run where they want to move very fast and be very efficient, but they also don't want to make a lot of noise. So, two very different ways to actually approach scenarios, and it makes it interesting to play with, at least for me, in concept, because I like fight scenes as problem solving.
The other thing, depending on setting, that might be worth looking at, it's probably not what you're thinking of initially, but it's there. Is 40K. It's Warhammer 40,000. That one, the technology is the entire theme with the setting is that it's a new technological dark age. The survivors of the previous apocalypses don't remember how to make new technology. Don't really remember how to develop new technology, and the surviving equipment is either painstakingly recreated through what really amounts to religious rites of replicating the exact designs and building it that way, or through maintaining and preserving these thousands years old guns, armor, and ships.
Well, it depends on which setting which group faction you're playing, really.
Well, yeah, I'm talking about Imperium.
Yeah, you're talking about Imperium.
But what you get there with the Space Marines are you've got people in really heavy powered armor that have these just ridiculously overpowered weapons. In any other setting, the bolters would be absurdly overpowered. These things are firing a 3/4 of an inch shell that's self propelled and will explode on penetration. It's not even on contact, it's on penetration with soft tissue. So they will literally liquefy enemies. It's ridiculously versatile stuff. The entire setting just dials the violence and the insanity to 11 and keeps dialing it.
Uh,
But yeah, but it might be what you're looking for also for, you know, combat situation where you've got a setting where you can literally drop 3 people onto a planet and that's enough. Um,
yeah, the Space Marines can take the entire planet with
so,
3 guys.
yeah.
Uh,
So this is one where it's
it's
like
yeah.
this is an option. This is something where you're like, well, I want to do a thing like Master Chief, you might want to look at this and decide if that's actually, if you want to dial it out that far. Uh,
And you can always dial it back too. Just because you see it one way in one thing doesn't mean it can't be some way another thing. It's always fun to read as much as possible, simply because of all the new fun toys
yeah.
that come with it. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, once you start and think about different approaches to combat based on characters and mentality, mindset, and what they're there for, it and their background and history, it starts to get really interesting for me. I'm rambling.
Yeah. Sorry, it's going to be a little bit of a rambling day today. Uh,
I have no sleep.
yeah, we have personal family issues rolling through right now that have just played havoc, and of course we scheduled this right before they happen, so that's how it works best. Hold on one sec. I need to add this to the show notes, and then I will pull another one. Okay. And Frederick, I hope that helped. I also hope I didn't horribly mispronounce your name. So we've got from Biorat Arts. I think I just mangled that one too. Hi, I have a question, something I'm currently working on. What kind of fighting do soldiers learn in special forces, especially U.S. military, and how effective are those in close combat?
Funny story about special forces. Uh, um, special forces guys, what their training really actually involves is a lot of sensory deprivation. I'm saying that wrong, but it's not so much that they do get upgraded combat skills, but what they're really being tested for and really being weeded out for is their ability to perform in high pressure situations for long periods of time. And so they're put through much more rigorous tests than you would your average recruit because they already have the training and they're building off of that military training, which informs basically their foundation uh, as they push them sort of higher. So this sort of treatment, like the special forces are the elites that get super advanced training that's absolutely different from everybody else, is kind of true, but it's also not. It's more that well,
They'll be given specialized. Okay, so when you get to actually specialized training that they'll receive, it's not, here's a form of hand to hand that's superior to what we give our normal soldiers. That's not what happens. They'll get the same hand to hand training as normal soldiers get. You don't want to create a situation where these guys are getting training. You don't want to create a situation where you have a better training system available, but then you don't use it. So it's not that. What you do end up with is they get more focused training, and sometimes they will actually get training in fields you would not normally expect to see for a soldier. Some things I've seen, like I actually know somebody who uh, was put through a special forces. I forget what the term was. Basically, it was supposed to be pre-screening. Like they put a bunch of raw recruits through this pre-screening thing, so they started them heading towards what they wanted for special forces from these guys. And what ended up happening was it's not, and he didn't make special forces, but what ended up happening was instead of doing the normal thing where when you go into the military initially, they'll train you on a pistol and a shotgun. Like, those are your initial two firearms qualifications, regardless what you're going to do with after that. They started him out with an assault rifle and with a light machine gun. They were training him for support position, squad support. And so he actually never received the basic training, the handgun, shotgun training at all, which kind of surprised me. That was something. And they started him out where they wanted him with this. Well, you're going to end up with infantry who they'll get the assault rifle training, like they'll get the rifle training. That's going to happen anyway. Usually that will come a little bit further down the line, um, still during initial training, but it'll come further down the line. And usually, when you're talking about something like a support weapon, as I understand it, that's going to be even further out if you're actually going into a field where you need to do that. But with him, they just pick it up right off the bat, and this is where he started. So it's not that he was being trained in, oh, here's a special way to operate these weapons. It was just, we're going to start you with this. And what I've seen from other people who have made special forces is it's not really that they're receiving special training that nobody else gets. They're getting a different mix of training from other people, and their training is being pressed harder. So I knew of somebody, this was years ago, I met him a couple of times. He was a ranger medic, and they've got this, he gets the same basic medical training as anyone else in the military who's going into a medic position. The difference is, to verify how good he is, they go through this grueling qualification regimen, and they're pushing him further than they're going to push a normal soldier in training. They'll demand more, they'll require more, and if you don't meet up to this, well, you're out. You're still part of the military, you're still a member of the rank and file, but you're not special forces. And a lot of the training really is just a lot of the training and the courses are just to screen you out, to push you as far as they can, because they're looking for people that, when in an actual situation you push them this far, they can deliver. And they push so hard that most recruits can't handle it. The actual content of the training, though, isn't that different from what they were getting before. The difference is they'll be doing this on no sleep. They'll be doing this for days and days at a time. They'll be doing this under much tighter scrutiny than normal. They'll be having to do stuff, they'll be having to do training segments where they cannot be detected. This isn't unique training, but the requirements are ramped up, and the consequences for failure are ramped up. So it's not so much it's unique training, it's just it's a crucible, because they're trying to screen out as many as they can.
And you get some very specific personalities that come out of uh, that training process that are fairly unique. Like most special forces guys are type A um, in their personality. They're capable of operating on their own outside the chain of command, behind enemy lines for long periods of time. They're able to assemble a plan, execute the plan efficiently with limited resources, often sometimes with no real support, being able to count on no real support from their own uh, military, depending on the circumstances. And they are the best of the best because they're capable of high performance in extreme circumstances that would demolish most troopers, most soldiers. I mean, I think I remember, and this just might be a weird memory, was with one of the ranger tests was they would take a goat out into the middle of nowhere
Yeah,
with
that's the medic.
yeah, the medic exam is they take a goat into the middle of take the medic recruit and then goat into the middle of nowhere, shoot the goat, and have the medic try to keep it alive for 24 hours.
Yeah, that's your final exam, by the way. They put a round through the goat's heart, and you've got to keep this thing alive without medical supplies. I think you get your normal medic bag, but I'm not sure about that. And you have to keep this animal alive for 24 hours to qualify to be an Army Ranger medic. That's not, it doesn't require specialized training. It just requires that you're able to keep doing your job without interruption for 24 hours. And I don't know how long you've ever tried to do one thing continuously, to say nothing of a very stressful, highly intensive thing. But yeah, that's what you see when you actually end up with somebody who's special forces. On the other side of this, you've got somebody where if you get shot, like you get shot through the heart, you are in a bad way. Keeping you alive for the next 35 minutes or the next hour or the next 2 hours until help can arrive, until you can be evacuated out, is not an impossibility. And it's not that their training is better, it's that they've conditioned themselves to the point where this is not a serious, well, it probably is a challenge, but it's not a serious challenge that they cannot achieve. They won't break and go, this is impossible, and then fall back from that, and then you die. They won't do that. and that's the point.
The guys that are capable of operating without on a week without sleep.
Yeah.
Those are your special forces guys.
Let's see. Hope that helps you there. Um, as for the actual hand-to-hand training, it's not that different. It's going to depend on which which division you're looking at, but it's still going to be the same basic adapted judo and jujitsu that were pulled out, that were brought back from by returning GIs after World War II, with bits of other stuff tacked in.
And each hand-to-hand form is going to be unique to which division of the military you're working with. For the most part, I think they have their own.
Yeah, they do. There's a little bit of variation there. The other thing you will see, or you might see with special forces, you're less likely to see with others, is cases where they've gone out and they've picked up other martial arts, stuff like Sistema, stuff like Krav Maga, where they've actually either they've learned from the soldiers that are, in those nations and have actually learned their styles to some extent, or they've specifically gone out and picked up pieces of it from elsewhere.
Pencak Silat is also popular.
Yeah, that's not a comprehensive list. Like, I'm not offering a comprehensive list there, but you will see a thing where they'll go out and they'll pick up other martial arts along the way. Um, but that's not part of their formal training. That's something they will do on their own to get better at being able to kill people.
Mhm.
Okay. I do hope that helps, though. It's not something I know a lot about. I've had experience with a few former special forces, and in at least one case, active duty. But it's not something I have a lot of insight with. So that's
The
about
best advice I can give is trying to look up either on YouTube or on Netflix old documentaries that were made about the special forces. Some of it is army propaganda, basically, but a lot of it is really helpful to see interviews done with actual members of the special forces, so you can get sort of a better beat on personality, um, which will be helpful to you in the long run, because the special forces, when you're writing special forces, one of the things that gets overlooked a lot is that different training produces different personalities, and stuff like the special forces training is actually designed to weed out personalities that won't work, um, which is why I say a lot of the guys are type A, um, and just sort of where they are is just a general rule, because they're capable of continuing to function under that environment. Um, and training conforms personalities too to fit the role. You change yourself as you're training to become what you need to be in order to fulfill whatever it is your goal is. One of the problems when you're looking at writing specifically and character development is a lot of the time, uh, even with special forces characters, the treatment of the martial skill and the personality are treated as separate rather than being interlocked together. So getting as much experience that you can, whether that's personal experience by interviewing military veterans or looking at it, just looking it up online and looking at tutorials or other things from ex special forces or special forces members, where there are actually a lot on YouTube, you can sort of get a beat for the sort of person that this training produces, depending on how close you want to actually adhere to reality. And that much is actually up to you. Whether you have a character with a personality that adheres to the training or not, that depends on how well you sell it ultimately, um, at the end of the day. But it is something to look at.
quick reminder, everybody. The should be on the left side of your screen. If you hover over there, you should be able to actually bring up the ask a new question option, like the Q&A question. And if you've got questions, you can just put that in there. when you clicked on it to bring up the sidebar, it should appear in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. It should be green, actually, and say, ask a new question. So if you've got any questions, feel free, because right now we're actually working through the two that are up there from a lizard are me working through stuff that's actually in our inbox right now that have been sitting there for a while. So part of the point of this is if you want to ask us questions directly, this is your chance. So letting you know, reminding everybody. At any rate, with that in mind, I'm going to bring up one of these. So this isn't a non-question, actually. Would it be better to carry multiple guns and a lot of ammunition for one gun into a fight, which would be faster? This one's actually going to really depend on when you're looking at and what types of guns you're talking about. If you're talking about a historical setting where you've got people with flintlocks or muskets, anything breech loading, or sorry, anything muzzle loading where you just have to manually load the powder, it's going to be faster to switch out guns. It's actually going to be faster in those cases. If you're talking about a modern day situation where you're walking around with a handgun, you've got 15 rounds in it, and it's a box fed mag, so you just pull out that, put a fresh one in, reloading is going to be faster. Reloading is going to be much faster. In fact, even at this point, even dual wielding will be slower than simply and less accurate than simply carrying a single pistol and an extra magazine for it. So this one, and if you're talking about revolvers, actually, if you're talking about a character walking around with a pair of revolvers in the 1860s, 1870s, where there's a fairly substantial reload process going on, then you're again talking about, well, an extra gun is probably going to be faster. But this one is entirely dependent on what the gun is and how long it's going to take you to reload it. And in a lot of cases, if you're carrying around a second gun, that's actually going to slow you down on your, and you've got one in each hand, it's going to slow you down on reloading each one far more than you'd make up for having to perform an extra reload. So, yeah, that one's fairly straightforward.
The multiple guns thing that I always thought was funny was from, Black Flag, where they've got like 6 down the chest. That's not actually that historically inaccurate.
Yeah, it's Edward's got 4, and then Blackbeard actually had 6. Like that was a thing. He'd carry 6 matchlocks into combat, and he'd stick the matches, these actual fuses that would be burning slowly, in his beard, and he'd light the matches on the pistol from the matches in his beard, and then fire it and just swap pistols instead of reloading.
The beard thing was mostly to terrorize people.
No, the beard thing was entirely to terrorize people.
Yep.
It worked.
Because your hair is on fire.
Yeah, and it's 400 years later, and we're still talking about the guy, so obviously it worked.
Yeah, it did. But that's something to actually consider if you're working in a historical setting and you actually want your character to carry guns, especially if they're in a place like ship-to-ship combat where those pistols would be really helpful to have multiple ones, where it's where you're in a very dense, very tight space. And reloading is going to be next to impossible. And then once you're out, you're out. So do you want to have the one shot or do you want to have 8? It's up to you.
Yeah, amusingly, there actually were double-barreled pistols. Like it was the same concept. You'd load both barrels and just go in with it. So 8 shots might sound a little crazy, but it's not, even on a muzzle loading barrel pistol. The double barrel stuff's a little bit more unusual, and you start seeing it with the Howdahs, which would have been, I want to say that's 1830, so that's much later, but these did exist. Also, pepper box pistols. I think those were some of the first revolvers, where you'd have to manually load each one and then rotate it. Still.
Oh, that's also true for post-apocalyptic characters, depending on what you want them to be carrying around.
Yeah, if you're looking at a zip gun where you have to half take it apart to reload it and put a fresh round in, then yeah, it would probably be faster to have a second gun. The trade-off is if you're in a setting where your guns are so ramshackle as that, you might not have the resources to make a second gun. So that is one to consider.
Yeah, I mean, or they've been fishing through old museum pieces, and those are the only guns that actually still work. and
Oh,
then
okay,
sort of
yeah.
figured out how to make it work. It depends on like what you're planning to do with your post-apocalyptic setting and what's survived, really. But it is something to think about if you're wanting to run something that has where you have limited ammunition or limited types of guns, uh, or different types of guns that are unique, and it's something to think about with the considerations
Yeah.
um, for the ways people overcome problems. Rather than just accepting that, oh well, I only have the one shot. The creative ones are the ones who win at the end of the day.
Yeah. At any rate. Okay. So, motherfucking Ishtar asks, what advice can you offer when it comes to writing about injuries and wounds acquired during a fight? I really want to improve the realism both during and after a fight. I also love your blog. You guys are awesome. Thanks for your help and such. And then that face that will forever remind me of the new Stormtrooper helmets.
One of the things to always remember about injuries and wounds, one, the big fear, big scare of, especially with knife fighting, is bleed out. The blood counts. That's the more wounds you have, the more the fighting goes on, the more your heart keeps pumping, the much more blood that's leaving your body. So one of the big major killer ultimately with a lot of knife fighting is actually the cuts, even if they're not in some place that's really truly sensitive. Even just shallow cuts on the body, a lot of them can lead to more substantial bleed out, especially the longer you fight. And that pain can actually work as you work inward to some place that's far more sensitive to get your kill in. And that's something to also to think about with your injuries and wounds with fighting is that they are actually a strategic. Pain is strategic with combat. Um, you can often use it as a distraction tool, where you hit somebody in the lower part of the body so they move to defend that area, which opens up the more sensitive region that they were actually defending to let you strike that. Um, it's that might not be quite what you're asking, but for a lot of fighters, that is sort of just bread and butter. Is that you apply pain here to gain access over here. You distract the mind one way to get it to open the door in the defenses. I know I see a lot of people asking questions about defenses too, about like how do I break defenses, and that's actually how you start opening up doors with the body. And injuries and wounds that are caused by predators are a major part of that. Somebody getting punched in the nose so their nose starts to swell will actually obscure their vision. Um, their eyes will start to water. The puffiness will start to block how well they see. And if they're crying or they get blood in their eyes, that all those affect how well they can fight. It's just like if somebody punches somebody in the throat, their hands go from, say, their stomach area or around protecting their face area, they'll actually start to go towards their throat. The same is true of the stomach. If you punch somebody in the stomach, their hands will actually start to go, and their whole body will tilt inward to protect that region of the body, which is how you lead into somebody punching somebody, sucker punching somebody in the stomach, and then grabbing for the head, for the hair to yank that head down into a rising knee, um, which is how one transitions to the other, um, which is where one of the parts of combat that's doesn't come across in fiction a lot, I think, because it's a little more advanced. Um, and sort of difficult to get right. The idea that you would use that to move to one place to the other. The obvious ones are like the sucker punch to the face, um, but often it's one hit instead of three hits. And with your trained combatants, it's going to be one, two, and then three, rather than just one. With somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing, they tend to lock everything on that one hit versus building into the different combinations. Um, I know that wasn't quite what you were asking, but I hope it was helpful.
Some personal observations, and this is sort of out of nowhere, but it might help. Um, when it comes to light lacerations, especially during a fight or during anything when adrenaline's pumping, it's something you're not actually going to notice happened often. If it's a deeper cut that's actually getting into tendons, it's not something I have personal experience with. But from the experience of having stabilizing tendons torn before, that you'll know, that you'll realize is there immediately, and that something has gone horribly wrong. But with like, I've had certainly had enough experiences getting bitten or scratched by animals to where you get these minor lacerations. It's something you won't actually notice initially. Um, and in some cases, also with bruising, you won't feel it when it happens. Bruise is actually blood vessels rupture under the surface of the skin, and you start hemorrhaging. You're bleeding internally. You can actually die from serious bruising, though the amount that you would have to bruise is slightly comical. But and it's just a blood loss issue. But with a bruise, it won't form until a few minutes after the injury has been sustained because it will swell up over time. And so what'll happen with bruising very often is you'll get hit and that'll kind of smart a little bit, but it's nothing unusual. And then a couple of minutes later, it's going to actually start hurting, and you'll actually get the swelling, and you'll see the discoloration, and that's when the bruise actually comes up. And as a side note, if you are killed between when the injury is sustained and before the bruise actually fully forms, it'll stop. Your body's as your body stops functioning. This is one of these things that will stop. You'll get to a point where blood will pool. It won't actually, you won't actually bleed normally. The blood will simply pool out of the body or pool in places in the body, and this will arrest the development of bruises. So if you've got somebody who was, in a fist fight right before they died, you're not going to have bruising on the knuckles because if they were killed before the bruises actually started to form. With bites and really with shallow penetration injuries in general, I've also had experience this with knives. Sometimes you won't even be able to tell you've been hurt. Like you might be able to feel a little bit off in the texture there. You'll know that you nearly got some connection, but you'll actually have to go back and check and examine to see if there's actually an injury there. It's something you sometimes see in film. It's something you don't see explained a lot or I haven't seen it explained a lot in text and prose. But there is actually a point between adrenaline and the way your body processes pain. Sometimes it can be actually kind of hard to tell if you've been injured immediately after it's happened. Uh,
As a quick side note for me specifically, when I was 12, I actually broke my leg in a spiral fracture doing a tornado kick. I didn't actually know that my leg was broken when I went down. I knew that I was in pain, but I didn't know what happened. And the shock of that, but specifically, I didn't really actually feel it, start to really feel it until I actually put my foot down and tried to walk on it. And my experience was I can't walk. And was the leg just actually gave out like right under me. Um, and I had to have two of our instructors help me to the bench. And then it started to hurt. But in the moments of it actually happening, I had no idea what was going on. It was very confusing. So it might be that your character starts experiencing pain from what could potentially be a severe injury and actually not know what it is if they've had no experience with it before. Um, the other thing I wanted to mention before we went on was sucker punches. What sucker punches actually do is when they hit the stomach, they're actually forcing all the air to leave the diaphragm to go in, and it actually punches up out of the body, which is why you go forward. But all the air actually leaves your lungs, and you expel the air. This is why in a lot of martial arts disciplines, for one thing, breathing is important for keeping the steady flow of oxygen flowing into your bloodstream, so your muscles remain strong, and you remain, have your air. But if in this case, what this means is as the air actually punches up and leaves the body, um, what the importance of breathing is that to protect your stomach from something like a sucker punch, you actually tense it before the hit occurs. And you do that by expelling breath out of your mouth, out of your lungs, out of your diaphragm, out of your stomach, and expel all that out so everything tightens up. So as you take, that allows you to take the hit. Um, that where you would have experienced a lot of pain or a lot more pain. And that sort of tilting forward motion as you move to protect that area, um, versus actually being able to use your muscles as quasi armor to take the hit for you, which you do by removing all air from your lungs and from that uh, part of your body. So when you actually have people making fun of, say, karate or taekwondo for their breathing exercises, that's actually what they're doing is they're expelling the air from their body to tighten everything up when they connect, so that they're ready to take their hits, uh, which is just interesting for physical reactions to things. Injuries. It's also a very common one. Um, in a question of if you're wondering how do I avoid the sucker punch, it's you tighten up before you get hit, or don't get hit. One of the two.
Oh, another stray sort of oddity. It's probably worth talking about, like, specifically with knife fights, but well, okay, it's something I've experienced with knives. When you get slashed with one, there is actually a lag time between when the blade connects and goes through the skin and goes through the tissue, and when the bleeding actually starts. It's not significant, but it's noticeable. It's significant enough that if you look at where you've been hit immediately afterwards, there'll be a moment before you can actually see the blood. It'll look like there's just a little welt there on the skin, and then it will start bleeding everywhere. Sorry, I've had personal experience with that a couple of times. It's not fun, but it is interesting to see where it's the injury happens, and as far as you can tell, it's fairly minor, and then it starts bleeding all over the place. Um, you know, fun stuff to know, certainly from firsthand experience.
Um, but yeah, pain for the distractor is the big one, um, especially if you're doing something more adept, like that requires more work to know, like pressure point, the kinds of pressure, different kinds of pressure point fighting, and joint locking techniques. Often rely on using ligaments and nerves, applying pain through nerves in the body, um, or in some cases just kicking somebody in the shin. Any point in your body with exposed bone, like your funny bone, your shin, your collarbone, um, actually wrapping on that will actually cause you fair amounts of pain because the nerves are close to the surface. So when somebody goes, "Oh, kicking somebody in the shin, that's stupid," well, actually kicking somebody in the shin works really well because ow, um, as sort of that distraction, pain sort of thing.
Okay, hope that helps. I'm gonna grab Biorat's next one. Um, Sorry, it disappeared a second ago on the screen. I was like, oh wait, did he escape? Did he leave? Any rate,
Did you run away?
I hope not. Any rate, okay. Um, Two more questions. Do military medics wear badges or something like that? And if they do, where? And what damage do hollow point bullets deal when hitting the body? They do wear medical personnel do wear insignia to identify what their job is. Um, I'm not sure if field medics do. I think they do. I think it's a collar insignia or something like that, but it's going to vary depending on what service they're in.
They used to wear, depending on your point in history, uh, for what military you wanted to do, they used to be a lot more visible. They're not now because enemies target them.
Even though it's actually a war crime to target them specifically, they will. Also, there's a difference between dedicated medical personnel and field medics in uniform and in how their insignia is displayed. So I'm not sure offhand. that one's actually some of the specifics of military insignia I'm not really well versed on. Um,
Killing the medic is kind of twofold. It's one, you're ensuring that the medic can't save any lives, and two, you're actually demoralizing your enemy uh, by taking out the medic.
Actually, it leads to a really nasty war tactic that has been used by a lot of people through history, called a honeypot, where you'll pick off, injure someone, and you won't finish them off. You'll, shoot them in the gut, shoot them in the leg, so they can't go anywhere, and then you'll just sit back and let them call for their friends to try to get to help them, and you'll pick off their friends as they come. Going after the medic is somewhat similar because, again, this is somebody who's very important. And this is one of the people that's actually critical if you do run a honeypot. So, one of those horrifying things of warfare. Um, Sometimes it's actually more useful to injure than to kill. That's actually part of why there's specific engagement laws about trying to egregiously injure large numbers of people as opposed to actually killing them.
Yeah, egregiously injuring large numbers of people actually has its uses. Um,
And this is where hollow point bullets actually come in. So basically, what a hollow point bullet is, it's a round that has a divot in the front end of the round. Sometimes these are scored. Um, there's actually ball tip rounds that would be scored called dum dums. It's a similar concept, but hollow points do this naturally, simply as a result of the design. And what happens is when they connect the body, lead is a very soft metal. When you start pressing against it, when you start pushing on it, it's very easy to deform, even with your fingers, actually, in some cases. And when you're forcing a chunk of lead through a human body at high velocity, and the lead is being pulled in two different directions at once, for example, because there is a hollow tip in it, there's this divot in the front end of the bullet, it's going to go in multiple directions. And so what hollow point rounds will do is they'll actually flatten out and expand inside the body, and sometimes they'll actually shear apart, not as frequently, but they will open up and they will just tear a huge chunk through the tissue as they're going. Um, and this will do a lot of internal damage. And the related rounds, the dum dum rounds, I think it's flangeable rounds, will actually fragment into shrapnel in the body and bounce around in there and tear everything up. And what it allows is it allows you to do a lot of damage to soft tissue, just massive tissue disruption, without really needing to do anything exotic to the bullet itself. Um, so what those do is they connect and then they just do horrific things.
nice for flesh, bad for body armor.
Yeah, specifically with hollow points and also with the others, because we're talking a sort of path of least resistance situation. When it connects with a body armor, when it connects with a solid plate, or also when it connects to a wall or something like that, it's much more inclined to simply flatten out. And as it flattens out, it will lose the ability to push through. Like, it's depleting energy, it's spending energy to expand as opposed to go through. When you're talking about it literally going through meat, that's not a problem. When you're talking about it hitting concrete or even just ceramic plate armor, that will actually start to slow it down and stop it. And potentially, in some cases, well, actually, with most hollow point rounds, it will actually stop in on body armor that's rated for normal bullets of that quality, of that caliber. So, yeah, body armor will usually stop it. It's a situation where you're going to feel it. It's still a lot of force, but it's not going to kill you because
Um,
the armor stopped it.
the spring assistants are actually an interesting point about specialized ammunition types, which is that it's another part of prepping for warfare, which is you bring the ammunition type with you that is going to be most useful in the situation that you find yourself facing. So if you know you're going to be up against a well outfitted military force that's going to be outfitted in standard body gear, even just like flak jackets, hollow point rounds aren't really going to be too much of your friend.
Uh,
So you bring the ammo type for what you're dealing with, just in the same way you would bring the weapon for what you're dealing with.
I'm actually going to bring up one of these weird things to do to a hollow point round. This is unfortunately something that could actually happen, but a specific example comes from Law and Order as a thought process, even though it's legitimately something you can do with the round. You can put fulminated mercury or picric acid in the tip, in the hollow divot, seal it over with wax or something similar. In a revolver, this will work. In a semi-automatic, the pressure of the mechanism could cause problems. But in a revolver, you load this round, you fire it, it will actually turn a hollow point round into an improvised high explosive round. And then when it connects, it's going to be all kinds of nasty. Picric acid used to be used as primer. This is highly explosive stuff. It's not easy to obtain. You can synthesize this stuff. I forget exactly how, but it is something that someone with sufficient chemistry background and access to a lab could synthesize. But it's dangerous stuff. Fulminated mercury, you just need mercury and the willingness to cook it properly, and you can create this stuff. And I think fulminated mercury was also used as a primer at one point. So again, the initial charge you use to ignite powder in a cartridge, um, it's explosive enough that if you knock on it, it will detonate. Or if you put it at the front end of a bullet and then shoot somebody with it, it will be enough to cause it to explode on contact.
So if you're working with characters who have limited access to the type of ammunition they can obtain, but want to jury rig the ammunition they have to do something else, that's an option uh, for cleverness.
Also, in case anybody thought exploding bullets was just a sci-fi thing, but no, actually, unfortunately, it's not. You can do that.
Yay, science!
Better murdering through science.
Science. Never
Okay.
forget.
If anybody else has a question, please send it in now. Otherwise, we're probably going to head into the last question for the day.
Any takers?
Okay. I was wondering if you had any advice for using your environment in a fight for context. I've been playing a tabletop RPG, and my character isn't great in a fight, but he can interact with the environment easier than other characters.
Um, a lot of questions about how to use your environment really depend on what's in your environment. Like, actually sit down and take some time to actually think about what is there. If you're asking, a hotel room versus a bar versus, I think we've talked about bars before, which is you can use the chairs, you can use the beer bottles, you can use uh, the alcohol and a lighter for Molotov cocktails if you're really feeling destructive. Um, it's really a matter of what is there to be used as a weapon. Um, so start. Um, One of the best tips I have is actually to when you go out anywhere in the world, whether it's a shopping mall, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's a toy store, it doesn't matter. Start playing the game with yourself of, is it a weapon? Which is you look,
one?
or yeah, can you make it one? Which is you look at any item sitting on the table, on the rack, and you play the game with yourself. Is it a weapon? It might lead to you wondering whether or not you could brain somebody with a can of beans, but you could.
You can.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, you can. You can mess somebody up.
But it might lead to better ideas cycling through your brain as you're starting to sit down to write after you've been in like the Safeway and the different aisles looking at stuff. But even just as you're getting groceries, keep a weather eye out for what you pass by because there are a lot of utensils, cooking utensils that can actually be used as weapons. So it's just a question of, is it a weapon? And then you let your brain get creative. which is possibly not quite as helpful now, but will be helpful in the future.
Yeah. Keeping track of stuff in your environment, um, looking at how you can weaponize your environment, also looking at what the kind of, looking at where your character is going to be. Sometimes this means literally, if it's something like if it's a public place like a mall or a restaurant, it's someplace you can go, it's someplace you can see. Um, if you're trying to sort through though on someplace you can't be, you might have to resort to image references. Look at what's actually there. Look at the place you're talking about, and see what to expect.
And if it's something like a medieval setting, look up similar things on the internet. Somebody will have said something about what is there, probably.
Yeah. Um, the other thing, and this is something actually, I'm always a little iffy on this. When you come in and say, I'm working with a character from an RPG, and they have an easier time interacting with the environment. Actually, I have a hang up when somebody says they come in and say, I'm coming from an RPG with this character. RPGs are very, very contextual for how they treat and how they interact with the world. So the tools you actually have to work with in an RPG will define how your character can interact with the world. If you've got a character who has a specific feat set, that's going to be a toolbox they can work with. If they don't have, no, sorry, let's step back from that. If you're just asking me about advice in general, I don't know what that tool set is, and it always makes questions like this a little tricky because the advice I would give to somebody, actually the advice I have given to people for creating characters for D&D or for other role-playing games, is very different from the advice I would give if I was saying, here's how you build a character for writing. So if you're just looking for ideas of what your character can interact with in the environment, your best friend here is actually going to be the game master, unless they're actually working against you. Unless your DM, your GM is actually working against you and is trying to screw with the players, they're your best friend in making sure your character can work the way they're supposed to. They're your best friend for letting you do the stuff you want to. And sometimes their job is they're in the context of the game. Sometimes their job is to tell you, no, that's not how it works, or no, this won't work with the other players. You'd be stealing the show. But they're the ones you need to talk to first about how do I use this. And if they don't know the rules and you don't know the rules, it's probably time to start looking specifically at that RPG and what people have said online about that RPG and how this specific skill set works together. Uh, it's a strange thing coming out of writing to then get asked about this because it's easy to say this for the purposes of I'm writing a character and I want them to do this. It's a lot harder when somebody's saying I'm writing a character or I'm role playing a character in D&D or I'm role playing a character in Shadowrun, and I don't know. Like I don't know which one it is. I don't know what the rule set you've got or what the limitations you're working under is. Obviously, if you've got a character who's a mage in a game where magic is focused on manipulating the environment, like Mage the Ascension, that's going to be very different from I have a character who just is really good at parkour. So sorry if that's a non-answer. Any rate, we have one last question from. I'm going to try
We're
this.
gonna butcher it. I'm sorry.
Uh, Thias van Preet. I hope I got that close. I'm curious about your thoughts on superhuman fighting, specifically what sort of traits the individual would drastically start to alter how a fight would go down compared to a normal fight. Flight, speed, strength, durability, etc.
When you start actually adding stuff in, you change a lot about the way that combat works. Because combat is basically ultimately a form. I will come back to this all the time. That combat is basically a form of problem solving, and different abilities, different ways of approaching a problem will solve it, and the different training methods you have, the different your different backgrounds will change how you approach the problem. And adding superpowers like drastically changes can, or at least it can drastically change how you would approach a problem, um, and how you choose to solve it. I mean, my favorite distinction ultimately is going to be between Batman and Superman, where Batman has to, for the most part, go in fairly carefully to avoid the bullets and take the guys down one by one from as he jumps on them from out from the shadows or hauls them up off into the rafters and terrifies them in the process. But this is all done because he really can't afford to take the straight bullet. Whereas Superman just walks in, punches his way through the lead door, takes the laser rifles all to the chest, and just walks in a lot of the time, and it's a done deal.
Yeah.
Because he's Superman, really. And what are you going to do to him? Unless you brought something helpful.
Yeah, if you brought kryptonite. But
Yeah.
If you're asking about these specific lists, a lot of actual combat builds around. I'm going to take these in reverse order. A lot of combat actually builds around how can you put somebody down as fast as possible. If you have a character who's superhumanly resilient to damage, being able to stop them suddenly becomes really problematic. Even if you have a character who isn't strictly superhumanly resistant to damage, but is just inhumanly resistant to pain. I still love the Jet Li film Black Mask. I swear it's a translation error where they keep saying these people, they know no fear. Or no, that's not that. It's they know no pain, and then they'll be screaming in agony, and then just rip their hand off and get back up. But if you've got somebody who's superhumanly resistant to damage, suddenly all of your assumptions about how you stop someone through violence don't work quite right.
Or just resilient.
Yeah,
They don't even have to be Wolverine.
yeah, no, not even regeneration. Just you can't hurt
Just
them.
resilient.
Um, in that case, you can, and assuming there's no strength element, you can still restrain them the way you normally, the way you would in a non-lethal situation, probably. But the normal, oh, I'm just going to roll it over and put this guy on the ground is not an option. Um,
Ultimately, the rules change.
yeah. Strength is one where, well, actually, this is kind of funny. Strength is one where it fundamentally just means you can't let them connect at all. If you're fighting against somebody who has super strength and you don't,
And you're
you
not
cannot,
superhumanly resilient to damage.
yeah, you can't take a hit at all. And in normal combat, you're going to be taking hits. The classic advice is don't get hit. No, that's a nice idea. It's not going to happen. But specifically with superhuman strength, that's you're going to really need to play it very safe, very cautiously, and avoid them having the opportunity to connect because that's going to be something that will seriously injure you.
Mm-hmm.
A character with super speed, uh, depending on how it's handled, you could be screwed with that one, just straight up. Um, Even a character who has a marginal speed advantage, like not even like flash type speed, but just has the ability to push slightly towards bullet time type, you're screwed because you're going to be reacting far behind them.
Combat is in large part about timing, too. The actual process of hitting somebody else and having it be effective is actually you managing to time it right, where you actually uh, at the point of connection you actually lock up your arm and lock everything up to take the impact, but that you don't do it before then. Um, no, we talk about it in martial arts as being a slow and release or lock and stop or whatever you want to call it, but when you're actually throwing a punch, you can't afford to tighten up your muscles because it actually slows you down. If you tighten too early, you actually lose the force of impact and the force that's gained by momentum. And if you tighten up too late and you impact the body, you actually risk hurting yourself because you actually are taking all that force into an arm that is extraordinarily loose and not prepped to take the damage. This is how a lot of people's wrists get broken or their fingers get broken when they don't know how to fight because they don't know how to lock their wrist or they don't know how to lock their fingers. And actually, this is one of the things that comes around with Tumblr a lot, where you see the self-defense techniques that get passed around, and they're talking about, oh, well, remember not to stick your finger in your hand. That's only part of the problem. Actually learning how to lock your wrists so that and tighten that up so the whole arm is actually tight when the punch connects is actually important to ensuring that you don't break your wrist just through the impact of the force of impact as that rolls up through the arm. Because as much as we treat fighting as taking and receiving, you are always taking. If you hit somebody, you are always taking in some regard. It's just how much can you mitigate the taking of it will dictate how badly you get hurt, whether or not, and how effective your technique is. So if somebody has super speed where they're actually moving slightly faster than you, that can really impact, even just slightly faster than you, faster than normal, that can actually really impact your ability to function and fight them, because you can't match up your own points of timing and your mind's, your body's own timing with theirs, because they're always getting there first, they're slightly out of the way, or you're not actually able to lock up and punch through when you need to. That could actually be a really devastating one.
Flight's the kind of easy one where it's just they can fly. Um, and the short answer there is if they're off the ground and they're out of reach, you're not touching them if they're off the ground and out of reach. Depending on how the flight and the setting works, it may or may not matter if both characters have flight and they're pounding on each other. Like, it really depends on how their flight, how their ability to fly works. If it's just they can fix themselves to a point, an abstract point, and say screw gravity and go up and down wherever they want, then they can probably fight from that the way you would fight on the ground, more or less, just with the options of verticality. If you're talking about dealing with one character with flight, you better just bring a gun, or an arrow, or a crossbow.
Something ranged.
But something, yeah, something ranged, because you're not going to be able to, you won't be able to engage them on your terms, only on theirs. When you're matching these guys up against each other, I think this is what you were actually meaning when you were matching them against. You have to look for where these will actually start to counteract each other and where they will connect. So if you've got two characters with super strength fighting, that's one where they neither one can afford to let the other one contact at all. They need to stay out of reach of each other, and they need to stay away from one another. If you have two
Especially if
characters,
they don't have that added durability. Also, the thing if you have two characters that are in the sky with super strength, but they don't actually have durability, when one of them hits the other, that could be bad. Or when one of them knocks the other into a wall, that could also be bad. Very bad. Depending on how realistic you want to get.
um, when you're talking about two characters with durability fighting each other, like, this insane damage resilience, you're probably going to end up with something that will look a little bit like either the fights from Terminator, where you've got from Terminator 2, and from the TV series where you've got two of the robots going at each other because, well, they're not going to damage each other this way except from egregious damage. So you have a situation where you can actually set up these sort of stupid Hollywood, long-running Hollywood fights that can't really happen in the world. When you have two characters with super speed going at each other, that's basically just going to be, it will look a little bit like a ramped up wuxia film, depending on what their training is, what they know what to do. But when you start mismatching these things, like you put somebody with speed against somebody with strength, or you put somebody with strength against somebody with durability, you can create situations where they'll kind of counter each other, or where it will just, one will steamroll the other. And a lot of this gets down to exactly how you've put together your characters and their superpowers and how their superpowers work. So this is one of these things where
It is also worth always remembering your priorities. Your characters can't sit around punching each other forever. Uh, no matter how many powers they have, or for any real reason, it's important to keep in mind as you're writing your fight scenes, as you go into your fight scenes, the reasons for why they're fighting, what they're trying to accomplish, and how that helps or hinders them in towards their goal. If one of them is one of them has the goal of they just need to stop the other from actually going anywhere, that's a very different fight compared to the guy who needs to be across town in 20 minutes and is trying to get away from the guy that's trying to hold him and keep him here. That's where you start to actually make these sorts of fights really where they really get the tension going is what are their priorities? What are they looking to do? How much time do they have left? How long can this actually go on? And what does each one want and plan to do? And the overriding goals they have outside of these sequences. And those are what's going to keep more than just fun writing of your fight scenes. That's what's going to keep your fights interesting. Is remembering your characters and their priorities and what they want to accomplish, what their goals are, and how that fight and how this is going to help them, hurt them, or possibly both. Uh, and it's sort of like if you've got a superhero, can they afford to stand around fighting the villain for 20 minutes while the house over there burns and people are dying? Depends on the superhero.
Oh, straight thing about strength that occurs to me now. I didn't say it earlier. Sorry. It's worth remembering with strength, it still doesn't, no matter how strong you are, unless the superpower specifically does this, it doesn't cancel out physics. So you can have a character who can lift, say, 5,000 pounds. Okay, cool. They can't lift a car. Like, they can't pick up the car and then start pounding it into somebody else. It's not an issue of they can't lift it, they don't have the strength. It's the car is bigger than them. They will force themselves into the concrete.
But they
Not,
could kick it.
yeah, oh yeah, they could kick it.
Of course, the average human can actually kick a car. So,
Yeah, that's true.
it sounds a lot more impressive than it actually is.
Yeah. Same thing with flipping them, actually, because of the way cars are structured. There's actually a Hollywood gag where you'll cut a small divot in the concrete, and then you can just lift. Like you cut these little small divots in the concrete under the wheels about halfway, and then it only takes about 10 pounds force to lift the car up at a 45-degree angle. It looks like you're just, holy shit, this person is now a superhuman, but no, it's about 10 pounds force. You just lift the car up. It's just leverage. Looks really cool though.
Yeah.
So that's something to think about. I hope that answers your question.
Anyway, we should be probably thinking about wrapping this up because I'm going to start falling asleep in my chair.
It's been a real pleasure, guys. It's great to have you around here.
Yeah, it is. We really enjoy answering your questions. And remember that we do have our Patreon for How to Fight Right. And donations are always welcome. So.
Also, we will be doing this again soon, sooner than the last gap. There's been a lot of stuff going on, and it's completely screwed with our schedule. And we've finally gotten most of that out of the way, so we're going to get back to doing these more regularly. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.